All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see you all here, and it's super exciting to be here with Matt today. Really grateful that he is here and joining us. But before we begin, I just want to invite everyone to please turn their cameras on if you're able. It would be really great to see your faces for this hour. We'd love to just see you and connect and be able to see your faces for the presentation today. So if you're in a place where you can, please turn those cameras on. It'd be great to see you. And as you're listening, please, if you have any questions, type them in the chat and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. But before we begin, I want to introduce Bay Nature briefly. My name is Leah and I'm Bay Nature's event coordinator. Many of you probably know Bay Nature already as a quarterly print publication, and we have magazines that come out every 3 months that are focused on local nature conservation topics that are local to the Bay Area. And we also have our website, which also features news and nature content on a weekly basis that's published on our website. And in the last few months, we've also been building up our events program with virtual programs like this one, as well as in-person events like hikes, bio blitzes, and even boat tours, a few of them. And so really grateful for you all to be supporting our event program as well as our media organization. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Matt Lau. Matt was a wildlife biologist with the Point Reyes National Seashore, where he led the management and monitoring program for the federally listed western snowy plovers. He has worked with snowy plovers for over 12 years at Point Reyes since 2016 and in Northern California while working on his master's degree in wildlife biology at Cal Poly Humboldt. As a National Park Service biologist, he has also worked with northern elephant seals, Point Reyes mountain beavers, and other shorebirds of the seashore. His interests include shorebird ecology and conservation, bat conservation, spatial ecology, conservation education, and diversity and inclusion work. He's also a nature and portrait photographer and enjoys sharing his conservation work through photos. And I'll be sending a link out to his website after the talk, as well as a link to this recording. So thank you all for joining. Please turn your cameras on, and I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Leah, for that great introduction. And thanks everyone else for coming and joining to talk about snowy plovers on in the middle of the day on a Tuesday. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. And as Leah mentioned, I have moved on from the National Park Service in Point Reyes, and I'm now working as an associate biologist for a really cool environmental consulting company based in Arizona called Logan Simpson. Check them out. But that being said, I have worked with snowy plovers for over a decade, and I will always hold them in a special place in my heart. So I'm really excited to be here to talk about them with you all. And I'm going to start off this presentation with a really fun video here that should work. And hopefully y'all can hear the really cute noises that
You can
this
hear.
male snowy plover is vocalizing. So what you're witnessing here is a snowy plover nest hatch. As you can see, there's at least 2 chicks that are fully hatched and mostly dry. And you'll notice, if you can get a look at the tip of the bill of the chicks, they still have like a little white speck at the very tip of their bill. And that's just the what's called the egg tooth, and it's a holdover from reptiles and dinosaurs, and it basically helps the chicks break out of the eggs much more easily. And I'm afraid I'm gonna have to move on from this video. I know it's really cute, but there's gonna be more cute photos throughout the presentation. So really quickly, it's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to go over a little bit about snowy plover natural history and some background on them, and then dive into their breeding biology and ecology, which is probably the most studied aspect of snowy plovers. And then go into conservation work that's happening in Point Reyes National Seashore, and talk about our monitoring efforts and the management work that's happening there. And then end the presentation with a status update about the population in Point Reyes National Seashore. All right. So a little bit of a background. So as some of you may know, their scientific name, or specifically their genus, actually changed recently this past year. So they used to be the Coradrius novosus. They are now have been changed to Anarhynchus novosus, and that's because of some genetic studies that have been conducted in the past several years that have examined the whole plover family as a group, and the researchers realize there's a lot of genetic differences amongst the group, and so there's been some shifts and name changes. So yeah, they're now called Anarhynchus novosus. Snowy plovers inhabit not just ocean fronting beaches, but they will also be found on riverine gravel bars, shorelines of lagoons such as Abbott's Lagoon and Point Reyes, and then even some inland saline lakes like Mono Lake, Great Salt Lake, where they nest during the nesting season. There is a distinct population segment that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service identified, also known as a DPS, for a subspecies of snowy plovers called the Western snowy plover. And it's this specific DPS that is listed as federally threatened on the Federal Endangered Species Act. Snowy plovers are one of the least numerous shorebirds in North America, and the most recent estimate was around 26,000 individuals in all of North America. And I believe that estimate was in 2012. And going back to the DPS, that protected subspecies group, that Pacific Coast population estimate is anywhere between 24 to 2,500 birds. I'll talk a little bit about the different subspecies just actually here in the slide. So the Western snowy plover, that subspecies group that I was just talking about, is known as Anarhynchus novosus novosus, and they can be found all throughout the Gulf Coast of Mexico, along the Pacific coast in California and Oregon, and Washington, going down to Baja California, and then there's parts of that population that breeds inland at like some of those salt lakes and some salt flats as well. There's two other subspecies, the Caribbean snowy plover, and then we've got the Humboldt snowy plover down in South America, Anarhynchus novosus occidentalis. And so I mentioned that distinct population segment, that DPS, that is listed on the federal endangered species list, and those birds are those that nest along the coast from Washington south all the way down to Southern California. And that's mostly the subspecies subgroup that I'm going to be talking about today, including most specifically those in Point Reyes National Seashore. Right, so snowy plovers are a voracious predator of a variety of invertebrates. They basically eat anything that's crawling around in the sand, from spiders, insects, flies, polychaete worms, basically anything they see that's crawling in the sand, they'll grab it. And birds that breed inland pretty much have similar diets. They'll eat beetles, spiders, flies, isopods, but pretty much the same thing. Anything that's crawling on the ground, they'll chase after. And snowy plovers, along with other plovers in general, actually exhibit this foraging style that's kind of the stop, look, chase style, which is in contrast to sandpipers such as sanderlings. If you go to the beach next time, just watch how sandpipers will use their longer bills to probe into the sand and feel around for anything that's crawling a little bit deeper into the sand column, whereas plovers are mostly just grabbing things off of the surface. So I've got this cool video here showing that behavior. So you'll see snowy plovers here just kind of stopping, looking around for prey, chasing, stopping, looking, chase. So this is pretty typical of a winter flock of snowy plovers foraging. And this is a video from Limontor Beach in Point Reyes. So I mentioned the types of habitat that they can be found in. The upper left photo is the most typical on ocean frontings, sandy beach habitats. The upper right photo shows a snowy plover that's amongst some really cool endangered tide streams lupin, which is part of the Abbott's Lagoon restoration area. So they will nest in native dune plant habitat as long as it still affords them a wide open view of their surroundings to keep an eye out for predators and biologists coming their way. The photo on the bottom right is a little bit more of an atypical breeding habitat. That's a photo of the Eel River gravel bars with Fern Bridge in the background, if you're familiar. And they used to nest along those riverine gravel bars in Humboldt. And they no longer do, but have historically. All right, so that's a little bit of background and natural history about snowy plovers. I'm going to transition into breeding biology. And so the breeding season is typically anywhere between March till September, and it of course varies by latitude. So plovers nesting in Southern California may start nesting earlier in the season, say like February, early March. In Point Reyes, we tend to find our very first nests of the season the last week of March or the first week of April. And then birds start pairing up in these winter flocks that they coalesce in during the non-breeding season. And once pairs are bonded together, they go to the territory that they want to nest in and they start courting. And part of that process is forming these, what we call scrapes, which are basically shallow depressions in the sand. So you can look at these as like practice nests. Both male and female will do or make these, and they can make anywhere between a couple to a dozen of these scrapes within a relatively small area, usually within 50 meters of one another. And during this process, they may be, or actually, back rewinding a little bit, this is a really cool video of a female creating a scrape. And this is a plover that was recorded in Northern California in Humboldt County, where I did my graduate thesis. And so you'll see this female, who you can see is banded, using her legs to kick back sand and using her chest to create this circular shallow depression in the sand. And sometimes you actually see them kind of moving in a circular motion to create that almost near perfect depression in the sand. So yeah, during this whole process of scraping, you may observe the male and female actually copulate. And what's really cool about snowy plovers, I'm not sure if this is seen in other plovers in the world, but during the process of copulation, the male, once he's finished, will actually fall back on his back and with his wings outstretched and form these sand angels, or what we call copulation angels. And if you're lucky, you will find one, and that's a sure sign that plovers are nesting in the area. Here's a really cool video of that same female who was scraping in the last video with her mate. Wings outstretched, falls back, sand angel, and then get up and like pretend like nothing's happened. And so notice the difference between the male and the female. Female's on the right, male on the left. So you'll notice a darker black head cap, darker black neck collar, and both of those coloration stripes are a little bit thicker on the male compared to the female on the right. So peak nesting season is typically between mid-April to mid-June, at least for Point Reyes. And as you have probably assumed correctly, they nest on the ground in the sand, and they will utilize a variety of different beach substrates. for camouflage of the nest. And so you can actually see in the photo on the left that pair has started using dried villela. Looks like some tiny little sticks, and then they're using the coarse sand to help camouflage that nest. The photo on the right shows a really cool nest where a female and male have decided to lay their eggs in the crux of this stick with an overarching um, branch over the nest. And as you can notice that there are some white pebbles decorating that nest, and it's very common for birds, especially in Point Reyes, to collect these white pebbles and decorate the nest. Um, we're not sure what the purposes of that is for, because it doesn't quite help with camouflage. It almost attracts, or like it makes it a little bit more vibrant, in my opinion. So we're not quite sure what that purpose of decorating the nest with white pebbles is for. Um, yeah, and so other beach debris they may use are they'll use shell fragments, dried kelp. I've seen nests underneath logs and in woody debris piles, and even next to human refuse. So here's some examples of nests. So I mentioned that they sometimes nest underneath overarching logs. It's pretty uncommon, but it can happen. So when we're surveying, we do make sure we're peeking underneath overhanging logs just to make sure there's no nests under there. The photo on the upper right is much more typical of snowy plover nests. So on wide open, sandy, flat ground with a little bit of beach debris. So in that photo, they're using some dried kelp and eelgrass. And then the photo on the lower left is a great example of the white pebbles that they use for decoration. The photo or the nest on the lower right is much more atypical. So they usually like nesting out in the open. In this net or on this nest, the male and female decided to actually hide their nest inside a not so dense area of American beach grass, Lamus mollis. So we're gonna play a little bit of a game here of find the nest. So this example is pretty obvious. There's three eggs kind of hidden on this flat open area with not a whole lot of debris to camouflage it. It looks like, I believe that was dried European sea rocket that it's nestled next to. This is a little bit of a step up. So there's three eggs in this photo. I'll let you take several seconds to look for it, but the nest is hidden amongst some beach burr, some dried villela, which are all those little white pieces kind of scattered throughout the photo. There's three eggs there. And then this is a great example of how hard it can find, or how hard it is to find nests in really coarse, sandy beach habitat, especially amongst some rocks. And so the hint for this one is there are only two eggs in this nest, and it is hidden amongst the kind of the central area with all the rocks. And I'll just give a few more seconds for you to look for it. So there's two eggs there. And this last one is pretty interesting. This is also a pretty atypical nest. They do like to use driftwood to hide their nests, or to kind of hide their nests behind. In this case, this pair decided to hide their nest in this really massive woody debris pile that washed up during a storm. And the only way we found this nest was because we were walking down the beach and we saw the female that was incubating dart off of the nest really quickly. And there's three eggs right there. So as you can probably tell, they lay a clutch of 3 eggs, and that whole process takes anywhere between 4 to 5 days. And they usually lay an egg every other day. Um, and then once all 3 eggs are laid, incubation begins, and it takes on average about 28 days to fully incubate and for the eggs to hatch. And another interesting thing about snowy plovers is that the male almost always only incubates at night, whereas the female incubates all throughout the day. And once the nest hatches, the chicks are born precocial, meaning that they're fully feathered. And then within the day, they're able to feed themselves, and they're walking and running within a few hours of hatch, which is pretty incredible. In contrast to like a lot of songbirds that are born fully naked, unfeathered, and are fully reliant and dependent on the parents to take care of them. And so at this point, the male is in charge of taking care of the chicks and raising them for about another 28 days on average until they are ready to fledge. And at that point, the female actually abandons them, and she goes off to find another mate to establish a new nest for the season. And then usually the male leads the chicks away from the nest site, and he'll show them where to find food. They never directly feed the chicks. So the male is in charge of showing them where to eat, and then also protecting them from predators. And so the first week of life for the chicks is typically the hardest for them. And as they age, survival increases dramatically. And as I mentioned, they on average take about 28 days or so until they're fully feathered and grown in size to almost the same size as the adult male, and are fully feathered to fly on their own. And so this is a photo of a few hour old chicks. You can actually see the white tips of the bill still, so they still have their egg tooths, which will fall off within a couple hours of hatching. Here's a photo of a chick that's about a week old with dad. You can see that he's color banded, and I'll talk a little bit more about color bands a little bit later. Here's a photo of chicks that are approximately 3.5 weeks old. So they're at this point little puffballs with legs. And then they enter the awkward teenage stage. It's on the left as a chick that's about 3.5, 4 weeks old. You can see he's missing some neck feathers with the male in the foreground. And then on the right, you've got some fledglings that are about probably somewhere between 28 to 36 days old. So you can see they're fully feathered. They've got their flight feathers grown in, but they look really scruffy as if they had just woken up from a nap. And at that point, they're fully independent of the dad. And at that point, the dad actually leaves them, and depending on the time of the season, he may go off and find another mate to establish another nest. So every season, a female can have up to 3 successful nests, and then a male can have up to 2 successful nests. And so you may know that plovers, especially killdeer, which is a close relative of snowy plovers, perform broken wing displays whenever predators or biologists gets too close to their nest or their chicks. And so this is something that we actually look for when we're searching for broods, when we're monitoring how many chicks they may have. So here's a quick video of that behavior. And then you'll also notice that they are fanning out their tail feathers. And here's a good look at the white outer tail rectrices or tail feathers. And they fan that out as they're doing the broken wing display because it's a great like white flash that really draws your attention to the bird. So it's a great way for anti-predator tactics. All right, so that's their breeding biology. I'm going to transition into recovery and conservation and monitoring and management in the seashore. Um, so in 2007, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service established the species recovery plan, and they identified three different factors that are limiting population recovery for the western snowy plover. Number one, obviously habitat loss, which is affecting pretty much every sensitive and listed species across the planet. Um, and specifically for snowy plovers, it's because of two different things. Invasive dune plants, including European beach grass, pictured there on the upper right, and then, of course, ice plant. And both of these invasive species completely cover dune ecosystems and gets rid of that wide open habitat that snowy plovers really prefer. The second cause of habitat loss for snowy plovers is human beach development, and that's pictured there on the lower right at Pajaro Dunes in Monterey County. But fortunately, we don't have to deal with that in Point Reyes National Seashore. The second factor limiting population recovery for western snowy plovers is disturbance, and that comes in a variety of forms. So there's off-road vehicles, horses, off-leash dogs, and on-leash dogs can both have negative effects and consequences for nesting snowy plovers. And then even just your average beachgoer who doesn't or isn't aware of snowy plovers nesting on the beach. The third limiting factor that's preventing population recovery is predation by a multitude of different predators. So in Point Reyes, it's namely the coyotes, striped skunks, at least for mammals. All these other predators have effects elsewhere up and down the coast. As for avian predators, we've got northern harriers, falcons, great horned owls, and namely common ravens. Common ravens are the primary predator and negative impact by predators in Point Reyes, but also across the board, across the range. And there's a lot of predator management happening to prevent raven impacts on snowy plovers. And pictured here is a trap camera photo of a nest exclosure that's protecting a snowy plover nest. And as you can see, these ravens are drawn to the exclosure and are checking out the nest. And I'll talk a little bit more about nest exclosures in a few minutes. As for monitoring in the park, so we complete beach surveys at each site anywhere between 1 to 3 times a week, depending on how much nesting activity we're finding. And what's really happening, so they start in March, the first week of March, and go all the way until September, until the last chick fledges. And once we go to a site, what we do is we have binoculars and a spotting scope, scan the beach. We're looking for plovers, and once we find a plover, we try and see if it's paired with another bird. And then once we figure out if it's paired or not, we observe their behavior, looking for signs of nervousness, which may include they exhibit this head bobbing behavior, which indicates nervousness. So they'll kind of head bob up and down like that. And whenever we see that, we know that they're nervous, that there may be that we're too close to their nest. And then obviously we're looking for broken wing displays, which means that we're definitely close to their nest, or they may have chicks in the area. Sometimes we may even see them scraping or copulating, and those are all signs that we're looking for to determine if there's nesting in an area. So once we record all of those observations, we also make sure that we look for color bands. So most of our birds in Point Reyes are color banded. And there's a photo here that shows how we read the colors and how we notate it. And actually in that photo is the record holder for the oldest known snowy plover, orange, red, yellow, red in Northern California. And he was about 23 years old, which is pretty incredible for a small bird. And so going back to surveying, so once we record all that information, and if we find that there's behaviors indicating that a bird has a nest, we're going to start searching for the nest. We perform systematic searches in the area where we see or where we first found the bird. And then we also collect ancillary data on predators, visitor activity to give us an idea of disturbance and then predator activity in the snowy plover habitat. So once we find a nest, we record its location with a GPS, and then in Point Reyes, we prioritize managing the population to ensure that productivity, or we try and influence to increase productivity for these snowy plovers because we want the population to increase and recover over time. So we monitor nests every 3 to 4 days, and we often put nest exclosures around the nest to protect the eggs. And so these nest exclosures increase nest survival upwards of 30 to 40% higher than if it wasn't exclosed. And so on average, nest exclosures, or I should say, nests that are exclosed have a survival rate upwards of anywhere between 80 to 95%. And without the exclosures, the average nest success is anywhere between 30 to 45%. And so we perform nest checks every 3 to 4 days, and then we check it all the way until it hatches. So around the 28th day mark. And I mentioned that we band our chicks with color bands, and this is done across the range. And it's part of monitoring efforts to monitor chick survival, monitor movements and dispersal of birds. There's this range-wide network working groups that work and collaborate together to share this data. So sometimes, for example, we get information about birds that are traveling to like Mendocino County, north of Point Reyes, or even farther afield up to like Oregon and Washington. And that's all useful data for us and as part of just the range-wide scientific network. And so we try and get to the nests the morning of hatch because, as I mentioned, these chicks are precocial and they are off and running pretty much within a couple hours. And as the days go on past the second, third day, it's exponentially difficult to capture these chicks and band them. So we want to get there as they're just after hatch to make sure that we can grab all three, band them really quickly. It's a 20 to 30 minute process. And then we release them to the adults who are usually not that happy with us. But it's all part of monitoring efforts to help recover the species. And so I was talking a little bit about exclosures. Pictured on the upper left is an older style of a really large 4-foot tall nest exclosure that used fiberglass poles. And you can actually see the incubating female in the center on the ground of that exclosure. So that gives you a reference of how big those ones were. In 2021, we started using mini exclosures that are about 2 feet tall. So pretty much half the size of the larger ones. And we shifted to these smaller ones because we were hoping that it would reduce the amount of attention that it drew from predators and then visitors as well. And the smaller size allows the incubating plover quicker access out of the exclosure for them to escape predators more easily. And I should mention that one of the drawbacks with these exclosures is that it could potentially increase adult mortality because obviously a predator may be flying by and see this thing and see that there's a plover inside. And so we've had incidents in Point Reyes, but also elsewhere up and down the coast where we've lost adults to predators because they couldn't escape from the exclosure quickly enough. So that highlights the importance of frequent monitoring to make sure that the incubating plovers are okay, um, and make sure that they have access all around the exclosure in and out as quickly as possible. Um, we also utilize trap cameras to monitor for predators to make sure there's no, great horned owls or ravens that are visiting the exclosure frequently. Another management tactic that we use is symbolic fencing in the park. So if you've been to Point Reyes National Seashore during the summer season, you may have seen the miles and miles of symbolic fencing that we use to basically reduce disturbance on nesting birds as well as males that are trying to raise their chicks. And so we deploy these before the season starts along areas where we know plovers have frequently nested. Um, and then whenever we find a nest at a site that isn't fenced off already, we will protect it with symbolic fencing to give the incubating plovers enough space to um, not be disturbed by people walking by. Um, yeah. We also employ beach closures and beach restrictions in the park. These are really useful, especially during the height of the summer season. And so the number of visitors, I guess the peak season of the number of visitors visiting the beach overlaps with peak season for nesting snowy plovers, unfortunately. And so these beach closures are really useful to just completely get rid of all kinds of disturbance on nesting plovers. And so this photo shows a beach closure fencing and sign that has blocked off the entire beach from North Beach parking lot going all the way up to Abbott's Lagoon. So that's approximately a 3 to 4 mile stretch of beach where most of our plovers in the park are nesting. And then, of course, public education is a huge component of the snowy plover conservation program in the park. And so we have a large group of snowy plover docents that are out at all of the nesting sites on weekends during the summer to interact with visitors coming to the beach, spreading awareness about snowy plovers, and trying to ensure that people are just aware about their potential impacts on not just snowy plovers, but just the park as a whole. And so these are vital employees of, or I should say volunteers of the program, and they have a significant consequential impacts on snowy plover conservation. All right, quick time check. Just want to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end. So I'm going to transition into the status of snowy plovers in Point Reyes. So pictured here is a map of the northern end of the park. If you're not familiar with Point Reyes, it's roughly an hour north of San Francisco in central California. And yeah, snowy plovers tend to nest on the northern end of the park. We have 7 different sites that we survey. So K is Kehoe. The RA is the Abbott's Lagoon Restoration Area, which is this really massive and incredible dune restoration area that provides a ton of habitat, not just for snowy plovers, but a variety of different species, including 2 endangered plants. And then NP is north of North Beach parking lot. So that's that really large stretch between North Beach parking lot up to Abbott's Lagoon that we usually close on weekends during the height of the nesting snowy plover season. And then south of North Beach parking lot, we have North Beach, and then South Beach down to the lighthouse. And then across the way, we've got Limassol Beach and then Drake Spit. And so here we've got the number of nests at each site we had this past season, the 2024 nesting season. So we had 5 nests on Kehoe Beach, 20 on NP. We had 5 nests in the RA, 3 on North Beach. And then we haven't had any activity on South Beach since 2020, 2021. And then we had 7 nests on lemon tortoise spit. And then most notably, we had 1 nest on drake spit, which was found by one of our snowy plover monitoring volunteers on her very first survey day of the season. And this was actually the first nest on Drake Spit since the 1980s. And it happened to successfully hatch without a nest exclosure. And then it fledged 2 of the 3 chicks ultimately. So it's a great success story. And here we have a chart of population size going throughout the years. So we've got the year on the x-axis, the total number of individuals in the breeding population on the y-axis. And we have a gap between 1989 and 95 because there was no monitoring being conducted there. But the most important thing to note here is that in the past several years, the population has been on the rise. And this past season, we had about 50 individuals in the breeding population, which is the highest it's been since the 1980s. So things are looking good. And hopefully it'll continue increasing in the next few years. And I should note that that black line just above the 60 individual line is our conservation goal. So we need to meet 64 breeding individuals in the parks in order to be delisted. And all of the breeding areas across the range from Washington down to Southern California have a target goal to meet in order for the entire subspecies to be delisted. So this chart shows the number of nests by survey site. I know it's a little bit busy. So you've got the total number of nests on the y-axis, the year on the x-axis. And the thing to take away from this is that the number of colors increase after about 2013, 14. And that just basically shows that birds are spreading across the park to a bunch of different sites to breed. And that's just a reflection of the growing population size over time. So here's some summary stats from this past nesting season. So I mentioned that there were 50 breeding adults. We found a total of 41 nests across all of those sites. 28 of those 41 nests hatched, giving us a 68% hatch rate. And then 79 chicks hatched from those 28 nests. And then 31 of those chicks successfully fledged. So they survived for 28 days. So that gave us a 39.2% chick survival rate. And for the sake of time, I'm going to rush through. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this and move on to the next slide. So these are some of the same stats that we just looked at. So at the very bottom, we've got the average between 2016 to 2024, and then we've got years going down to 2020 as you go up the table. And then we've got stats about nests, eggs, and then chicks. So the thing I will point out here is that, let's see here. So the number of fledges we had was 31, which gave us a 39.2% fledge rate. So if you look at those, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but I'm circling those numbers. So if you compare those numbers to the mean below, you can see it's a lot higher in terms of number of fledges. The percent of fledged chicks was slightly below average, but it's also another record-breaking year in terms of the number of fledged chicks. It's the highest we've ever had since the 1980s, which is pretty incredible. All right. So how can you help snowy plovers? So I mentioned the Snowy Plover Docent Program, which is this awesome program that serves an interpretive function to help spread awareness to visitors that visit the park. It really helps biologists and the park with education, and they have significant contributions to the Snowy Plover Conservation Program. And then if you have any shorebird or data collection experience, we do have a Snowy Plover monitoring volunteer program. And they basically help out with surveying sites that have probably little bit less activity, nesting activity than some of the bigger sites to help with covering ground and checking nests and things. And I can provide emails for contacts for people to reach out to if you're interested in that. And then if you're just visiting the park, obviously avoid fenced areas on the beach, pay attention to signage and not just um, plover signage, but like wherever you go to visit, whichever park you visit or whatever natural area you visit, just make sure you're paying attention to signage. It's there for a reason. Um, One big thing that most people don't realize is that driftwood forts can have a negative impact on nesting snowy plovers because if you leave them behind, it provides perches for ravens, falcons, predators for snowy plovers. And so if you do decide to build driftwood forts on the beach, make sure you dismantle them when you're done. Um, and it also, if you remove driftwood, it could also remove some substrate and camouflage material for snowy plovers that they could use for their nests. And then, of course, being mindful of any pet restrictions, practice leave no trace, pack out old garbage that could potentially attract predators to snowy plover areas. Being mindful about where you fly kites is really important because plovers can see kites as predators and it may keep them off of a nest if you're flying a kite right next to a fenced area. And then also being curious about your impacts wherever you go is hugely important. And with that, I'm going to end it with this really cute video of some snowy plover chicks. On the bottom is my email address if you have any questions and you want to reach out. Um, and then if you see a snowy plover that is color banded, you can actually report those color bands to this Google group that's an email listed there. And if you can, try and grab a photo of the color banded bird. That really helps, especially if you're uncertain about the colors. Yeah, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Matt. That was amazing and so awesome. Super informative and so many cool
Thanks.
photos. Thank you for sharing. And we do have time for a Q&A and looks like we already have some great questions in the chat. Those of you who have your questions, please type them in and we'll get to as many as possible. I got one question earlier that was a question about the survival rate of plover chicks to maturity. And I think you already answered that where you had said it's about 35 to 40%? Is that?
Yeah, on average, if you're looking at the long-term average going all the way back to like 1996, it's roughly between 40 to 45%
Hmm,
around there.
gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then looks like we have a question from Claudia Newbold. Claudia, do you mind unmuting and asking your question? And I'm also happy to ask anyone's question for them if they'd rather me ask. But whoever, Claudia, do you want to
Yeah,
unmute?
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I'm just curious about it, how the enclosure works with incubation. How do the chicks get in and out? And yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if I explained it very well, but so these exclosures have openings that are about 2 inches by 4 inches, and it allows both the incubating adult and the chicks free access in and out of the exclosure. Um, Once the chicks hatch, they usually never come back into the inside of the exclosure. After a couple hours, they'll depart with dad and move elsewhere. But yes, the exclosure allows the incubating birds free access in and out while preventing predation by um, a multitude of different predators.
Gotcha. Thank you, Matt, and thank you for your question, Claudia. It's a good question. And Sungji in the chat had also clarified a bit, asking about or noting the difference between an enclosure versus an exclosure. Is that, yeah, how would you define that distinction?
Yeah, so I call these exclosures because they exclose predators from accessing the inside, whereas I feel like an enclosure keeps something in. So I apologize if I was using enclosures as a term during the presentation, but we refer to these as exclosures.
Gotcha. No, I think you used exclosure. I think I only heard exclosure myself, but and
Okay.
then got a question from Alex. Alex, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Hi, I live in Bodega Bay and am on Duran Beach a lot and see large groups of what I thought were plovers, and I didn't know if they gather in large groups, and often I see those birds around godwits and willets, I think. Just curious.
Yeah. So typically during the nesting season, they're not going to be in those large groups, but you may be seeing. So I'm thinking you're probably seeing these birds during the winter season in these large groups. Um, During the winter, they do coalesce into these larger flocks, um, but they don't usually number more than um, 30 to 40 birds. If you're seeing really large group of more than like 50 to 100 birds in a flock, then I'm thinking it's likely sanderlings or some other sandpiper, especially if they're hanging out with godwits and some of the other larger sandpipers. Um, but that being said, it could very well be snowy plovers because they do coalesce into winter flocks as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if you I didn't go too much into identification because I didn't have enough time, but if you're looking for snowy plovers, you're looking for um, kind of a shorter, more stout bill compared to sandpipers, which tend to have that longer, thinner bill that they use to protrude or dig into the sand. And snowy plovers tend to have kind of grayish legs, and they overall just look kind of like a dull white, kind of sandy color, whereas sanderlings are a little more contrasting and stick out a little bit more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Alex, for your question. We had a question from a Zoom user about one of the locations was labeled NP, and I think the person was wondering what that was referring to. And then they were also wondering what beach restoration project is being done at Bolinas Lagoon.
Yeah. So regarding that first question, that's also a question I've always had myself. um, we've never known like what NP actually stood for. We think it's north of parking lot, basically north of North Beach parking lot. So it's just that site designation for the stretch of beach between North Beach parking lot up to Abbott's Lagoon. Um, as for your second question, I'm not sure of what's going on at Bolinas Lagoon and what restoration efforts are going on there. Um, we do have dune restoration efforts that are ongoing in the park at Abbott's Lagoon, going south from Abbott's Lagoon towards North Beach parking lot. That happens every summer, just kind of at the tail end of the snowy plover nesting season.
Gotcha. Thank you. And thanks for your question. And we have a question from Kamiko. Kamiko, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. My question was, if they're born at Point Reyes, do they come back a nest at Point Reyes? And also, I'm curious about the winter flock we get. That I think they come from inland, but they're not from Point Reyes, I think.
Yeah. So your first question, it's kind of variable. We don't have a ton of good stats about return rates for birds that are born in the park. So it's I would say it's pretty variable. Some birds, if they survive the winter, will return. So we get anywhere between like 3 to 5 juveniles that will return the following season and nest in the park. And then we do get some data on birds that will go elsewhere to breed. So for example, we've had reports these past couple of years of 3 snowy plover banded birds up in Mendocino that have regularly nested up in that county for the past couple of years. Yeah, so it's pretty variable. Um, and then for your second question about winter flocks, I think you're asking about how or if a lot of those birds consist of birds that come from the breeding populations inland. Is that
Yeah,
correct,
just curious
Nico?
where they're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, so snowy plovers have this kind of interesting migration strategy. So all the birds that breed inland will actually come out to the coast to winter out on the coast with all of our year-round birds. And then all the birds that are on the coast year-round. So in Point Reyes, birds will disperse in all different directions, up, down the coast. So some of our birds breed in the park, but then they'll move in winter up north. They may go down south. Um, and so our winter flocks do consist of a variety of different individuals that breed elsewhere. So you in Point Reyes, we do get a huge influx of numbers of birds that winter in the park, and a lot of those come from inland, and then up and down the coast as well. So it's a good mix, and we know that because of our banding programs in the park and then across the range as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Kamiko. We have a couple minutes, so we'll do a speed round of the last remaining questions. We had a question also from Zoom user wondering about, do you know why the chick fledgling rate was so low in 2023?
We don't. It's hard to know what factors are influencing chick survival because of how mobile they are. So we do try and check on broods, or AKA the chicks with dads, at least once a week. Sometimes we can't find them because of how open and large the habitat is. So it's just so hard to tell what exactly is influencing low chick survival. We can hypothesize that it could be higher predator activity, so there just may be more ravens on the beach, or it could just be one or two problem ravens that are realizing that there's a bunch of snowy plover chicks in this area, and so they're going to be targeting the beach more. So it may not necessarily be that there's more ravens on the beach. It just could be a problem raven. So yeah, it's in summary, it's hard to say. We're not quite sure.
Thank you. And we also had a question asking for more for the contact information or how to volunteer, and it looks like Lena added a link to the docent program, and I'll include that link in the follow-up email to all of the attendees. So thank you all for your interest and for asking, and I'll be sure to include that and in the follow-up.
Thank you, Lena.
Yeah. And then we had a question from Tammy. Tammy, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Hi. I just heard you mention that the fledglings don't spend time, or even maybe before that, in the exclosure. So where do they go, like at night, and do they remain active during the night?
We're not quite sure. We so we don't really survey at night, and I'm not sure if anyone's really done any research on nighttime activity, but I imagine they're probably active at night as well, at foraging. They may be roosting. They will often utilize large pieces of woody debris to like hide behind, and they'll roost together. Yeah, but we're not quite sure what they're doing at night, to be honest. And in terms of the exclosure, they don't go into the exclosure itself, but the dad may bring them back to the same relative area and like hang out there if he for some reason thinks that area is good for food, or if it's good for predator protection. So yeah, they may be hanging out near the exclosure, but they won't be. We've never actually seen them walk into the exclosures once after they leave.
So, but when they first hatch, they will stay, or they'll go back to that spot. It's just once they fledge, or
Well, once they hatch, they typically leave the exclosure within a couple hours. So dad will actually lead them away from the nest site, whether that's like 10 feet, 20 feet,
Yeah.
Within a couple days, there was one brood where the dad actually took, I think they were about 2 days old. He took the chicks about a half mile to 3/4 of a mile up the beach, so they can move quickly and move any distance away from the nest site. It just kind of depends on what the
Well,
dad was thinking.
yep. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tammy, for your question. And last two, one from Claudia asking, how are the enclosures placed so that the predators can't tip them over?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the exclosures have built-in stakes, like prongs going all the way around the exclosures. So that helps kind of stake down the exclosure and prevent the wind, because we do get really strong winds in April and May that can potentially blow over the exclosures. And then on top of that, we have 6-inch long U stakes that we, like 4 to 6 of those that we additionally stake the exclosure down into the sand. Unfortunately, we haven't had an issue with a coyote or any other larger predator tipping over the exclosures.
Oh, gotcha. Cool. And then our last question was from Marcia, who was saying it sounds like Marcia is a guardian in Monterey County and was wondering about the difference in adolescent success rate in different areas or areas of the bay. It seems like the difference in mortality for these birds in different areas of the bay.
Uh, so I, we collaborate a lot, or I should say, National Park Service collaborates a lot with Point Blue Conservation Science that does work in Monterey. Um, I I'm not too familiar with their survival rates, and I can't say that it's the same across the board. So like if we have high juvenile survival in Point Reyes, it may not necessarily be the same in Monterey. Um, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure how Monterey did this past season, but I know that pretty much all organizations that do work with snowy plovers put out reports every year that has a lot of those stats and information. So, for example, Point Blue in Monterey already has their 2024 report out, and you can find some of that information there.
Hmm.
Sorry, I can't provide some more specifics.
It's okay, no worries. I actually had one last like random question, but you had mentioned that the plovers use Velella to line their nests, and I was wondering, is there a reason for that? Because I don't, Velella are like they're like cousins to the jellyfish, right? I think, and they're really tiny, and I'm just wondering why they would choose that to line their nests.
Yeah, I think it really, especially when vanilla dries to the point where the blue coloration disappears and it's just kind of that like white or clear coloration, it really helps um like camouflage the eggs, especially when you get like a dense pile of vanilla. Um, like this past couple years, I think we've had some pretty big washups of vanilla that produced a lot of that like dried substrate, and it's I think I haven't looked at the actual numbers, but I'm guessing nest survival is probably a little bit higher for nests that are sucked into Velella compared to others. It's just, yeah, it just hides the eggs so well.
That's so cool. That's fun to see. But yeah, I
Yeah,
think we can wrap it up there. Thanks to you all for joining and sticking around for the extra few minutes. But biggest thank you goes to Matt for sharing your presentation and sharing your expertise with us and the audience today. I think we all learned a lot, and they're such amazing and cute and amazing birds. So really appreciate you talking about them today. And maybe
my
we could
pleasure.
all just unmute and thank Matt for presenting. I can count us down from three, like 3, 2, 1, and then we'll say it. So, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you,
Thank
Matt.
you, Matt.
Thank you so much for being here, Matt, and thank you to everyone in the audience for being here. Please consider joining as a Bay Nature member if you're interested in more events like this, and I'll be sure to send the link out to this recording as well as all of the links we shared in the chat. So, thank you all for being here today.
Thanks,
And thank you.
everyone.